I made some necessary purchases and took the ferry across to the eastern bank. When I gave the ferryman a ruble for the crossing and told him all I had gone through to get to the spot where I was now riding comfortably for a ruble, he was quite dumbfounded and did not want to take the money. Anyhow, there I was, at last, on the other bank. Now I could venture no farther north, for I discovered that in those regions there were no vessels which would take me by the Arctic Ocean to Novaya Zemlya or to Franz Josef Island. And so I should have to go eastward into the region of the river Kolyma, and still further eastward to the Bering Strait, which was the only place where I could find captains who would engage me as a hand and take me farther north. About 3 days beyond Verkhoyansk, I came upon a small village inhabited by Yortens, fetishists, and a handful of Ohuts. They were kind-hearted people, living in hovels made of clay and lichens fastened together. This was the first time I had seen huts of this kind. I noticed how the people lived. They had no horses, only reindeer, but they milked their sheep, and from the milk they made very tasty cheese. I bought a plentiful stock of cheese and filled my cart with other provisions because they told me that I should now be crossing endless deserts. But they urged me not to be afraid because I should not encounter any wild animals there, and that I was sure to get across quite safely if my supplies last. About 5 days beyond this village, I passed through a pleasant region, and then every previous trace vanished, and there was not even a sign of a beaten track or of a reindeer's hoofprint. My goal was the settlement of Shatinak. The road seemed endless. When I at last got there, I was so dead beat that I could scarcely stand upright. I felt sick and shivery. I could not get warm, and then I suddenly came over quite hot again. I shook from head to foot, and my teeth chattered. There was a Cossack station in the township, and I managed to drag myself to the official in charge and told him that I was sick and tired out, that I was on my way from Krasnoyarsk to the Arctic Ocean, but that I should not get there because I was ill. The official told me to rest for a few days and that it would pass off, that it was only a touch of fever, which was making me tremble because I had overexerted myself. He asked me for my papers. I showed them to him. He examined them and nodded. He said that I was all right and that my papers were correct. He showed me to a place in a sort of hut. I do not know who lived there before, but the stench was enough to suffocate you. I made myself a bed there on the straw. I left my horse outside so he could graze on the fine grass, which grew there on a plain stretching as far as the eye could see, and then I rolled over on the grass and slept for 5 days and 5 nights, with brief intervals, when I took a mouthful of food, chewed it up, and turned it over on the other side for more sleep. When at last I recovered and had properly rested, what else was there for me but to continue my journey? The road from Shatinak to the settlement of Silvitar was a pleasant one. About 2 weeks beyond Shatinak, I came upon the river Indigirka, but I got to the other side easily because at this point the river was not broad, the tide happened to be low, and only on the other side did it reach as far as my shoulders. When I got across, I encountered moist, mossy soil, where in places the cart sank into the moss as far as the axle. Nobody could imagine how troublesome it was. I helped the horse along, and for a whole day I myself turned the wheel by the rim. But for all that, the two of us did not move forward more than about 2 miles a day. When after a few days I got out of this cursed region, I rested for about a day, then moved forward through easier country. I did not reach Silvitar because the winter set in and stopped me. I had now been traveling some time in the polar twilight. The snow was falling thicker and thicker each day, and I realized that I should have to take up my winter quarters in one of the small settlements. There were a number of villages sparsely scattered here and there along the plain. I came across one which was inhabited by only about 20 people, and nicely situated on the bank of a small river. It was there that I spent the winter. I lived with my horse in a small hut. We were together in one tiny room. At any rate, I kept nice and warm. During the months I lived there, I had an opportunity of becoming familiar with the villagers. The native women, mostly young, often came to visit me, but the look of them all was such that I would not even have laid a finger on them. Still, I put up with their visits, listened to their chatter, and learned a little of their language. One day I was surprised by their strange behavior. They waved their arms about in a queer sort of manner, as if they were throwing unseen objects at each other. While doing so, they roared with laughter. I did not know what the meaning of it was, but when I looked closer, I discovered they were throwing lice at each other. I was horrified, and of course I at once threw them all out. But by this time, I myself was full of lice, and I had quite got a job to get rid of them. I gave myself a thorough cleaning, boiled my clothes, and got rid of the vermin in that way. But from that time onward, I did not let any more women in. The women there had another odd custom. They would chew a large flea, swallow one half, more or less, while they threw the other half at me. I asked the men what this nonsense meant. They laughed and said the women must be in love with me. Really, a strange way of showing it. 3 months on a raft. That year, a fine spring set in early. In fact, I was able to leave in February from Selyer, which I reached after 6 weeks. The inhabitants were Mongols, and they had some shops there, but they were small. There I again laid in a cart full of supplies and set off towards the river Kolyma. I was told that upon this river there were 3 places called Kolymsk, Upper, Middle, and Lower. The natives explained to me that a chain of mountains, which I should hardly be able to cross, stretched from west to east at right angles to the river. Then it then occurred to me that as soon as I reached the Kolyma, I would again make a firm raft and travel on the river as far as Lower Kolymsk. In that region, the vegetation is not as wild as along the river Lena, and I should not have so much trouble if I wanted to get ashore to graze the horse and catch any animals. So when I reached the Kolyma, I at once began to cut down trees. I knew that the river would carry me hundreds and hundreds of miles to the north, and so the raft would have to be a substantial one. I made the raft much stronger than the previous one, and continued my journey. The 3 months which I spent on this raft formed a pleasant holiday. I even spent my nights on the water. Every evening I moored the raft to a tree on the bank so that the current should not carry me away and wreck me, and I slept under the awning in the cart. At 5 a.m, I found a shallow spot near the bank and let the horse loose to pasture. He grazed for 2 hours while I cooked my food for the whole day. At 7 I moved on. The reason why the journey took me so long was because I was often caught into eddies, and sometimes I had to work for 3 days before getting back into the current. Besides that, in places on the river Kolyma, there are clusters of timber floating along near both banks, and it is only with very great skill that a raft can be steered between these drifting masses. Sometimes this timber is piled up so high that if I had hit against it, the raft, and perhaps I myself too, would have come to a bad end. But higher up in the north, the river is enclosed on both sides by mountains. It is deeper and swifter, and the timber cannot collect at one spot in any quantity, and therefore progress there is easier. First of all, I passed through Upper Kolymsk, where I added to my supplies but did not stay. It was a small town with a convict colony, but I saw convicts there who were living freely with their families and were engaged in farming. They were not allowed to return home, but had to live in the holdings which had been allotted to them. In the country round Kolymsk, most of the natives were tillers of the soil. I also came across some Russians there, who gave me provisions and encouraged me by saying that I was now not far from my destination. As I had come so far, it would be child's play to get from there to the Arctic Ocean. Along the river, I reached Middle Kolymsk, after passing through a region in which there were ample signs of life. Beyond the town, in a deserted hut, where Mongols had probably once lived, I rested for a week. The hut stood not far from the road, along which the post used to go, northward to Lower Kolymsk. If I had had to reindeer then, I could have joined the Lamoots, who went past the post, and I should have reached Lower Kolimsk safely and quickly. But what chance would I have to part with my poor horse, which could only move along slowly? He could not have kept up with the reindeer for a single moment. I always used to look with envy the way those animals raced along, but I was not less fond of my horse because of that. On the contrary. The post consisted of 6 reindeer, 1 cart or sledge, and 2 people. One of them was a postal employee, and the other looked after the reindeer. The 2 Lamoots were well acquainted with the road, and as they told me, they covered more than 40 versts a day. They explained to me that the reindeer needed the tundra most of all, because lichens grow there. They said that there were plenty of them everywhere on the road. After resting for a week, I paid my first visit to the town. Middle Kolimsk lies on a river and amid extensive plains, and at that time, as far as I could estimate, it had close on 20,000 inhabitants. A curious thing happened to me in the town. I was not the only globetrotter who turned up there at that time. I came across a Frenchman, a thin, lanky fellow, who was traveling on foot from France to America. He had no horse or cart, but only a large bundle on his back. I suggested that he should join me because it would be more cheerful for the 2 of us. But he refused and said that I moved along too slowly, and he was in a hurry because he was traveling for a high wager. He could not afford to indulge in winter quarters, take roundabout routes, or anything of that sort. He must keep on and on. Rivers and mountains meant nothing to him, he said. He just had to keep pegging away. Years later, when I was at Nome in Alaska, I asked whether this man had come that way, and they all remembered him and knew when he had reached Nome. So I discovered that while I was leaving Lower Kolimsk, this man had long since left Nome by steamer for San Francisco. He was a wonderful chap. On the journey from Middle Kolimsk to Lower Kolimsk, and for long periods, there were no signs of a living soul along the river for hours at a time. Only here and there, a fishery reservation, nothing but Mongols, mostly shamanists and Baramists. There were no dense forests here, but only now and then a glimpse of a wood beside the water. But although it was so deserted, I did not run short of provisions. While the horse was grazing on the bank, I would shoot birds, of which there were countless flocks in the lower brushwood by the water. With 1 charge of buckshot, I sometimes wounded 30 to 50, but I never lingered for any length of time over this pasture. I wanted to hurry on as quickly as possible. The days were shortening, and I was anxious to reach Lower Kolimsk before winter set in. I knew that I should have to spend the winter there. I was very satisfied with my idea of using a raft, especially when I saw high mountains on both sides of the river, stretching east and west, as far as the eye could see. I should hardly have managed to get through that way, and I should have been obliged to make a circuit around the mountains, and who knows where I should have got, and when I should have reached Lower Kolimsk. On the way to this town, I came across 6 communistic villages. These were inhabited by political prisoners who had been living at liberty for many years. In fact, some of them were the descendants of prisoners who had lived there 100 years previously. At least that's what they told me. They were all very decent people in those villages, and as far as I could see, they were all living on equal terms. There were neither rich nor poor. They all said that they were happy there. By this time, they were not even white people, but all were mixed with Mongol blood. The increasing number of fishing settlements on the banks made it look as though I was getting near Lower Kolimsk. The natives pointed out to me that up to Kolimsk, the ebb and flow of the Arctic Ocean makes itself felt on the Kolyma. I felt rather excited. I knew that I had a long, long way to go from there to the Bering Strait, but the chief thing was that in a very short time I should reach the shores of the ocean, which meant so much to me. Having landed at Lower Kolimsk, I left the raft, which had carried me for so long on the waters of the Kolyma, and made my way into the town. I arranged with the innkeeper for accommodation, rode up there with my cart, fed my horse, and proceeded to inspect the town.